Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. It is October 1938, Madrid. The city has been surrounded for over 2 years. The streets are filled with broken rocks and pieces of buildings. Buildings are damaged by explosions, and windows are covered with any wood people could find. Children carry small metal cans to get water, while women wait in long lines for hours to get bread that might never come. Everyone is very hungry. Above them, the sound of an airplane cuts through the quiet air. Without thinking, people quickly hide. Many have lived too long knowing that death comes from the sky. But this time, there is no explosion. Instead, a paper bag floats down hanging from a small parachute. Comes down very slowly, like it's making fun of them. The bag is wrapped in a nationalist flag. A note is attached. In nationalist Spain, great and free, there is no home without a fire, and no family without bread. Inside, just one loaf of bread. One starving man runs forward, grabs it, and disappears into the narrow streets. The flag, the note, the mean show of it all, these are left behind. It is not a gift. It is meant to make fun of them. This is how the attack on Madrid was fought. Not only with bombs and guns, but with bread and words. By making fun of starving people on purpose, the nationalists under Francisco Franco had failed to take the capital in 1936. But instead of leaving, they stayed and used a terrible plan to slowly wear people down. Starve the heart of the Republic until it broke. For Madrid's defenders, it became a test of how long they could last, almost as much as a military fight. The people of the city, Republican soldiers, socialist fighters, anarchist groups, and ordinary families, held on to the belief that keeping Madrid safe meant keeping the Republic itself safe. As the attack dragged on, the city turned into both a battlefield and a symbol. News reporters from around the world reported on the courage of its defenders, calling Madrid the heart that will not give up. George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, and others would write about the city with amazement and sadness. Madrid became more than a capital. It became the stage where two different worlds fought for the future. Fascism and strict control on one side, democracy and revolution on the other. And yet, underneath the slogans and big words, it was ordinary people who suffered the most. Families boiled grass to fill their stomachs. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets, eaten by people who could no longer stand being hungry. Electricity stopped working, water became hard to find, and sickness attacked the weak population. To many, it seemed like time itself had stopped, replaced by the daily pattern of waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for the bombing to end, waiting for some small bit of hope that help was coming. But help never came. Madrid kept going, but at a terrible cost. And even in 1938, as the paper bag with one loaf floated mockingly from the sky, its defenders must have known that the end was coming. The Republic was running out of time. The Spanish Civil War was not only a fight inside Spain. It was a testing ground where new ideas, new armies, and new weapons were tried out. A practice run, many would later say, for the much bigger disaster that was coming soon, the Second World War. Madrid's attack was only one chapter. But to start here, surrounded by hunger, propaganda, and the cruel show of one loaf of bread, tells us everything we need to know about what kind of war this was. It was not just about land or armies. It was about breaking people's spirits. And in that, Franco's nationalists were already learning the methods of modern dictator war. The Spanish Civil War was more than a national tragedy. It was a signal to the world. From 1936 to 1939, Spain became a stage where the great ideas of the 20th century fought in a small version. Fascism, communism, democracy, and anarchism all fighting for control. All certain that history itself was on their side. To many people watching from other countries, Spain was a laboratory of the future. It was the first time Europe saw airplane bombing that was aimed at regular people on purpose, like in Guernica. It was the first time armored tank divisions combined speed and shock attacks that showed what the German blitzkrieg would be like later. It was a war where propaganda was as important as bullets, where radio, posters, and foreign news reporters shaped what people around the world thought. Germany and Italy saw Spain as an opportunity. For Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, Franco's rebellion was a testing ground. The Condor Legion bombed Spanish towns, not only to help the nationalists, but to practice terror bombing as a plan. Italian troops fought in Spain not just as helpers, but as students, practicing moves they would later use in North Africa and the Balkans. Even Portugal under Salazar, though smaller, offered quiet but important support, seeing Franco's victory as protection against revolution spreading across the area. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, the only major country to give official help to the Republic. Stalin did not support the Republicans out of pure belief in their ideas, but from cold planning. Spain was a chance to slow down the fascist wave while tying Western democracies into knots of not being able to decide. Yet his help came at a steep price. Soviet officers and political leaders sent not just weapons, but strict rules about ideas, forcing Spanish leftists to follow Moscow's orders or be called enemies. And in the middle, the democracies of Europe, Britain, France, and the United States chose to stay neutral, signing a non-intervention agreement that did little more than stop Republican hopes. Yet staying neutral did not mean not caring. Journalists, thinkers, and ordinary men and women across the world were fascinated by Spain's struggle. Thousands volunteered to fight in the international brigades, from American writers to Polish miners, from French students to Canadian workers. For them, Spain was the great moral cause of their time, a line in the sand against the rising wave of fascism. But Spain was not just a place where other countries fought. Its crisis grew from deep local roots, the failures of monarchy and republic, the unfairness of land ownership, the ancient control of the Catholic Church, the poverty of rural farmers, and the broken promises of democracy. The Civil War was the explosion of complaints that were centuries old, sharpened by the sharp ideas of the modern age. To people at the time, however, the meaning of Spain was clear. Today it is Spain, one French observer wrote. Tomorrow it will be all of Europe. He was right. The Spanish Civil War was not a separate conflict. It was a warning light shot into the darkening sky of the 1930s, showing the battle lines that would soon cover the entire world. Madrid's attack showed how modern war would starve and scare cities. Guernica's destruction showed how easily regular people could be hurt by war machines. And the betrayal of the Republic by the democracies of Europe showed how giving in and waiting could destroy nations. In Spain, the world got a glimpse of its own near future. The only tragedy was that so few people listened. Before he became El Caudillo, before statues and propaganda called him the savior of Spain, Francisco Franco was a quiet, almost plain officer. Unlike Mussolini's fiery speeches or Hitler's dramatic charm, Franco showed something else: cold planning, discipline, and an iron belief in order. He was not a man who made people feel passion. He made people obey. Franco's rise began far from Madrid, in Spain's colonial frontier. In Morocco, where Spanish troops fought a long and brutal war against Berber fighters, Franco earned his reputation. He commanded the regulars, Moroccan soldiers under Spanish officers, and shaped them into one of the most feared colonial armies in Europe. In those deserts and mountains, Franco developed the qualities that defined his leadership: caution paired with ruthlessness, an instinct for survival, and an almost magical devotion to order. By the early 1930s, Spain itself was falling apart. The monarchy had fallen, replaced by the Second Republic, a weak experiment in democracy. Land reforms, non-religious schools, and challenges to the Catholic Church released fierce resistance from conservatives. At the same time, peasants, workers, and students demanded faster, deeper change. Spain split along lines of class, faith, and ideas. And Franco, a monarchist at heart, watched with suspicion. His moment came in 1934 during the Asturian miners' revolt. The uprising was more than a strike. It was a revolution in small form. Workers took over towns, set up soviets, and fought government troops with dynamite and rifles. Franco, then a major general, led the crushing of the revolt with uncompromising force. The revolt was destroyed, leaving thousands dead and entire villages scarred. To his enemies, Franco was a butcher. To his supporters, he was a man who did what had to be done. This earned Franco both loyalty and a bad reputation among Spain's conservative elites, the generals, landowners, and church leaders. His name became the same as discipline and reliability. Among the working classes and the left, it became a warning of the future to come. In Parliament, the leader of the right-wing CETA party, José María Gil Robles, openly admired fascism and declared, "Democracy is not an end, but a way to conquer the new state. When the time comes, either Parliament gives in or we will get rid of it." His words were not a bluff. He looked to Franco and others like him to make that vision come true. By 1936, Spain was a powder keg. Elections brought a left-wing group, the Popular Front, to power. Conservatives panicked, believing the Republic was sliding toward revolution. The far right planned a coup, reaching out to generals they trusted to take over the state. Franco hesitated at first. His instinct was always caution. But when the moment came, he chose his side. In July 1936, the coup exploded. It did not succeed everywhere. But Franco's decision to join, and his command over the Army of Africa, would prove decisive. Within months, he was not just another general in rebellion. He was on the path to becoming the Generalissimo of Spain. What made Franco's rise so striking was not flashiness or brilliance, but his survival. He outlasted rivals, built up power step by step, and let events lift him up. In this way, Spain did not fall to a demagogue with fiery speeches, but to a cold, efficient soldier who believed in order above all else. The world had found a new kind of dictator, not the thundering tyrant of rallies, but the quiet one whose strength lay in patience and never giving up. Spain in the 1930s was not a country simply split in two. It was broken into many Spains, each carrying centuries of complaints. To outsiders, the Spanish Civil War often looked like a neat battle between left and right, between fascists and Republicans. But inside Spain, the breaks ran deeper, tangled with questions of land, faith, identity, and class. The countryside showed one of the sharpest divides. Huge estates were owned by a few aristocratic families and the Catholic Church, while millions of landless peasants struggled to survive on scraps of harvest. To them, the promises of the Republic, land redistribution, fair wages, education, were more than politics. They were the difference between hope and hunger. Yet these reforms threatened the very foundations of Spain's traditional elites. The Catholic Church, immensely powerful, stood as both a spiritual authority and a social institution. For centuries, it had been intertwined with monarchy and privilege. To conservatives, the Church represented the eternal soul of Spain. To progressives, it represented oppression and superstition. Churches were burned, priests attacked, and anti-church words flared in the streets, fueling a cycle of revenge that turned sermons into political battlegrounds. Meanwhile, Spain's cities pulsed with the energy of modern ideas. Workers' unions rallied beneath red banners. Anarchists painted walls with slogans demanding the end of all hierarchies, and thinkers debated in cafes about Marx, Bakunin, or the new Spain being born. For many in Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia, the 1930s felt like the dawn of revolution. For others, it felt like chaos. Regional identities sharpened the conflict further. Catalonia and the Basque Country demanded self-rule, asserting languages, cultures, and institutions long suppressed by Madrid. To nationalists, this was betrayal, an attack on the unity of Spain. To the regions, it was survival. Thus, the Civil War would not only be about ideas, it would also be about what it meant to be Spanish. This split found a symbol in the elections of 1936. On one side, the Popular Front, a group of left-wing parties. Socialists, communists, anarchists, and Republicans. On the other, CETA and conservative monarchists alarmed at what they saw as Spain's slide into Bolshevism. The vote was close. The atmosphere was filled with suspicion. For the winners, victory meant progress. For the losers, it meant the Republic had to be destroyed. What followed was a season of tension. Land seizures, political assassinations, church burnings, violent reprisals. Each side convinced that compromise was impossible. In villages, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. In cities, barricades went up, militias drilled in secret, and whispers of conspiracy filled the air. Spain was not drifting toward war. It was running toward it. The divide was not just political. It was cultural, almost spiritual. To many on the left, Spain was chained by centuries of monarchy, privilege, and superstition. They dreamed of a republic that would sweep away the old order. To many on the right, Spain was under attack from godless radicals who threatened family, faith, and tradition. They saw themselves not as rebels, but as guardians of civilization itself. This collision of worlds made compromise impossible. Spain had too many revolutions and counter-revolutions packed into too few years. And when the coup of 1936 exploded, it was not simply soldiers against the state. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, village against village. A nation divided had finally shattered. And once broken, it would not be easily repaired. On the night of July 17, 1936, Spain's fragile republic shattered. A group of generals, convinced that the Popular Front's victory at the ballot box spelled the death of their nation, launched a coup d'état. Their plan was simple: seize key cities, topple the government in Madrid, and present the world with a done deal. But Spain did not fall in a single stroke. The coup was only partly successful. In Morocco, where Franco commanded the Army of Africa, the uprising succeeded almost instantly. The Canary Islands, the Balearic Islands, and much of northern Spain also fell quickly into rebel hands. Yet in Madrid, Valencia, Barcelona, Bilbao, and much of the south, the people resisted. Soldiers loyal to the Republic, joined by workers' militias, seized weapons, stormed barracks, and fought street battles to keep their cities free. The coup split the country overnight. By July 20th, Spain was already divided into two hostile camps: the nationalists, with their stronghold in the north and west, and the Republicans, holding the industrial east, the capital, and much of the south. Trains stopped, telegraphs fell silent, and borders hardened. The nation was no longer governed. It was at war. The violence was immediate and merciless. In Seville, rebel troops crushed resistance with mass executions. In Barcelona, anarchist workers stormed barracks and drove the army into retreat, seizing control of the city. In Badajoz, the Army of Africa left a trail of bodies as it advanced, shocking even hardened observers. The Spanish Civil War had begun not with fronts and armies, but with massacres, reprisals, and the sudden collapse of order. For the conspirators, the coup had failed in its most crucial goal, Madrid. The capital remained in Republican hands. Crowds of workers, students, and loyal soldiers flooded the streets, armed with rifles, pistols, even kitchen knives. Anything they could find. They built barricades, set up checkpoints, and vowed that the Republic would not fall without a fight. In the chaos, Franco himself hesitated. Initially stationed in the Canary Islands, he waited to see which way events would turn. Only after securing German and Italian help to transport the Army of Africa across the Strait of Gibraltar did he fully commit. It was a gamble, but one that paid off. Within weeks, the best-trained troops in Spain were marching north toward the heart of the Republic. Yet in those early months, nothing was inevitable. Many believed the rebels would be crushed quickly. The Republic still held Spain's largest cities, its navy, and most of its air force. It commanded the loyalty of millions of workers and peasants. But its strength was chaotic, decentralized, and fragile, while the nationalists, though smaller in number, possessed the discipline of professional officers and the backing of conservative elites. Thus, the coup, intended as a lightning strike, instead unleashed a storm. Spain was plunged into a civil war that would last nearly 3 years, claim 500,000 lives, and leave scars still felt generations later. The failed coup had not ended the Republic, but it had doomed Spain. When the coup faltered on the mainland, the fate of the nationalist cause came to rest on one formation: the Army of Africa. Hardened by years of colonial warfare in Morocco, it was small in number but unmatched in discipline and fierceness. Its reputation alone spread fear across Spain. The Army of Africa was a mixed force. It included Spanish legionnaires, professional volunteers who had forged their identities in the brutal campaigns of the Rif War, and the regulars, Moroccan troops commanded by Spanish officers. These Moroccan soldiers, often promised better pay and treatment than they had ever known under colonial rule, brought both loyalty and ruthless efficiency. To Republicans, they were seen as mercenaries. To Franco, they were indispensable. When Franco secured German and Italian transport planes to airlift his men across the Strait of Gibraltar, It was more than a logistical miracle. It was the turning point that transformed a faltering coup into a full-blown war. Within days, African troops were fighting in Andalusia, leaving behind a trail of terror that shocked even seasoned war correspondents. Their methods were brutal, deliberately so. Villages that resisted were subjected to massacres. Prisoners were executed on the spot. Civilians accused of harboring Republican sympathies were punished with harsh violence. The aim was clear: terror as a weapon, fear as a tool of conquest. Stories spread quickly, whether whispered in villages or carried in Republican newspapers, that Franco's Africans showed no mercy. But brutality was only one side of their reputation. They were also professionals in a war too often fought by hastily armed militias. Where Republican columns stumbled forward with passion but little coordination, the Army of Africa advanced with precision. Their officers, known as Africanistas, prided themselves on tactical discipline and adaptability. It was this efficiency that allowed Franco's troops to carve through western Spain in 1936, seizing territory that became the backbone of nationalist Spain. For Franco himself, the Army of Africa was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of his authority. Other generals commanded regional forces, but only Franco held Spain's most battle-hardened troops. This gave him leverage over rivals and ensured that by October 1936, he was elevated to Generalissimo, supreme commander of the nationalist cause. Yet the Army of Africa was not all the same. Many of its Moroccan soldiers had been recruited with promises of land, money, or spiritual reward. Few cared about the politics of Madrid. Some saw themselves as fighting for survival, others as fulfilling obligations imposed by colonial masters. In Republican propaganda, these men were often portrayed as foreign invaders, Muslim troops unleashed against Christian Spain. The fear was deliberately stoked, adding a racial and religious edge to an already bitter conflict. The irony was cruel. A war that claimed to be fought for the soul of Spain was being decided in part by men who were not Spanish at all. And yet, without them, Franco's rebellion might have collapsed in its first months. By early 1937, the Army of Africa had grown from a few thousand to nearly 60,000 strong. Its reputation, professional, relentless, merciless, shaped the war's course. To Republicans, their advance felt like the march of doom. To Franco, they were the steel spine of his new order. Spain's future was being forged not only in Madrid and Barcelona, but in the dust of Andalusian roads and the blood-soaked fields of Extremadura, where the Army of Africa showed the world that discipline and terror could conquer even the most passionate resistance. By late summer 1936, the Army of Africa was no longer just a colonial garrison. It had become the spearhead of Franco's rebellion. With German Junkers planes flying troops across the strait and Italian ships patrolling the seas, Franco now possessed the most mobile and ruthless force in Spain. What followed was a campaign of shocking speed, what some observers described as a peninsular blitzkrieg. The advance began in the south, pushing through Andalusia with calculated fury. Towns fell in succession: Mérida, Badajoz, Toledo. Each conquest was marked by executions and reprisals designed not only to punish but to terrify. In Badajoz, Republican defenders fought street by street, only to be overwhelmed. What followed became infamous. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were executed in the city's bullring, their bodies left as a grim warning. The message was unmistakable: resist and be destroyed. Yet alongside terror came discipline. The African troops moved swiftly, covering ground faster than anyone had expected. Their officers coordinated artillery, infantry, and air support with precision rarely seen in Spain until then. This professionalism contrasted sharply with Republican militias, who often lacked coordination and charged bravely into hopeless fights. To many, it seemed as though the nationalists were guided by destiny, while the Republic stumbled in chaos. By September, Franco's troops were closing in on Toledo, where a nationalist garrison had held out for months in the Alcazar fortress. The siege had become symbolic, a test of endurance. When Franco finally relieved the defenders, the victory was celebrated across nationalist Spain as proof of divine favor. Newspapers hailed Franco not only as a general but as a savior. His rivals among the rebel generals, Mola, Quaipo Delano, Sanjurjo, faded in comparison. The campaign was forging not only a military path but a political one, elevating Franco above all others. Meanwhile, in Republican territory, the mood shifted from defiance to alarm. Reports of massacres in the south reached Madrid. Refugees poured into the capital, telling stories of African troops and their merciless advance. The Republic still controlled more territory and population, but morale began to crack. The fear was not only of defeat, it was of extinction. Foreign observers noted the contrast. The nationalists advance like an army, one correspondent wrote. The Republicans scatter like a crowd. This was not entirely fair. The Republic was still organizing, still integrating volunteers, still awaiting foreign aid. But perception mattered, and Franco's reputation as a disciplined commander only grew. By October 1936, Franco's position was secure. His troops had carved a path from Andalusia to central Spain, splitting Republican territory and threatening Madrid itself. His rivals, wary of his control over the Army of Africa, conceded leadership. Franco was declared generalissimo and head of state. The coup had failed to deliver an instant victory, but the blitz through Spain had given Franco the power to carry the war forward as its unquestioned leader. The Republic braced for the inevitable. Madrid, the heart of Spain, was now the next target. And all of Europe was watching. In November 1936, the nationalist tide surged toward Madrid. Franco believed the city's fall would end the war in weeks. His Army of Africa, reinforced by German and Italian troops, marched on the capital with confidence, while artillery thundered across the Manzanares River. To the world, it seemed only a matter of time before Madrid would collapse. But the city refused to die. Madrid's defense was chaotic, desperate, and yet astonishingly determined. Ordinary citizens, workers, teachers, students, took up rifles, pistols, even kitchen knives. Women sewed sandbags and built barricades. Children ran messages across sniper-swept streets. Posters shouted defiance, "No Pasaran, they shall not pass." The slogan became more than propaganda. It became a vow. The Republic poured everything into the defense. Loyal army units, anarchist militias, and hastily trained volunteers fought side by side. Soviet tanks rumbled through the avenues. Their crude armor cheered as symbols of salvation. The newly arrived international brigades, idealists from America, Britain, France, and beyond, marched in with ragged uniforms and unshakable resolve, their accents mingling in chants for freedom. The battles were fierce and intimate. Fighting raged in Casa de Campo Park, in university halls turned into fortresses, in streets where neighbors fired from opposite rooftops. The smell of smoke and explosives hung heavy as artillery shells shook the ground. At night, the glow of fires lit the horizon while loudspeakers blared patriotic songs to drown out fear. Yet Madrid was not only a battlefield, it was a symbol. International journalists swarmed to the city, reporting daily on its struggle. Ernest Hemingway described the courage of its defenders. George Orwell, though stationed in Catalonia, would later write of Spain as a place where ideals were tested in blood. Photographs of young volunteers with rifles and red armbands appeared in newspapers worldwide, inspiring sympathy for the Republic. For Franco, the failure to take Madrid was a bitter humiliation. His troops had conquered vast stretches of Spain, but the capital resisted with a ferocity he had not anticipated. Each assault, whether by infantry, cavalry, or tanks, was pushed back. The city's defenders, fueled by desperation and faith in their cause, held the line. The siege that followed would last nearly 3 years. Hunger, disease, and bombing raids became part of daily life. Civilians learned to recognize the drone of German planes. Children grew up in basements, drawing pictures of tanks and airplanes instead of flowers. The price of resistance was staggering, but surrender was unthinkable. Madrid's survival in 1936 transformed the war. It gave the Republic time to organize, to rally international volunteers, to establish itself as a government capable of fighting. For the world, it proved that fascism could be resisted. For Spain, it meant that the war would not be a quick coup, but a brutal, grinding conflict. The heart of the Republic continued to beat, even under siege. Madrid stood, and with it, hope endured, fragile, battered, but unbroken. The year 1937 tested both the Republic and the nationalists in fire and blood. Madrid still stood, but Spain's fate was far from decided. Each side sought to break the stalemate with daring offensives, campaigns that revealed not only military strength but also the weaknesses that would shape the war's outcome. In February, Franco struck first. His forces swept southward into Andalusia, targeting Malaga, a Republican-held port city. The assault was swift and merciless. Italian troops, eager to prove themselves, joined the attack, supported by warplanes that hammered the coastline. Republican defenders, poorly armed and badly coordinated, could not withstand the onslaught. When Malaga fell, thousands of civilians fled along the coastal road toward Almeria, hounded by aircraft and artillery in what became known as the Caravan of Death. It was not just a defeat. It was a massacre that seared itself into Spain's memory. The Republic sought to answer with its own offensive. In the spring, Republican commanders launched an ambitious assault on Zaragoza, a nationalist stronghold in Aragon. Soviet-supplied tanks, T-20 SAXS, rumbling iron beasts unfamiliar to Spanish soil, led the charge. Yet the operation was plagued with poor planning and chaotic coordination. Infantry units failed to support the tanks. Communications broke down, and Republican columns marched straight into fortified positions. The result was catastrophic. Tanks burned, soldiers fell in droves, and the offensive collapsed in confusion. These defeats underscored a painful truth. While the Republic had passion, it lacked the professional discipline of its enemy. Militias often fought bravely but without unity. Officers quarreled over ideas as much as strategy. Meanwhile, Franco's forces, bolstered by the Army of Africa and foreign support, advanced with ruthless efficiency. But not all was despair for the Republic. In the Basque Country, the defenders of Bilbao and surrounding towns fought with extraordinary courage. Behind hastily constructed fortifications known as the Iron Ring, Basque soldiers and civilians resisted for months against nationalist assaults. Their stand became legendary, even as Guernica burned under the bombs of the Condor Legion. Though Bilbao eventually fell, the Basques had shown that even against overwhelming force, defiance could endure. Throughout 1937, the war widened in intensity. Civilians became targets as much as soldiers. Cities and villages were bombed, not merely to kill but to terrorize. Hunger spread in Republican zones as supply lines faltered, while nationalist propaganda boasted of full stomachs and order. Both sides committed atrocities, and Spain became a land where trust withered and cruelty thrived. Foreign observers were struck by the contrast. An American volunteer wrote bitterly, "Courage and heroism are plentiful in Spain, and the Spanish people have no lack of it. What they need is tactics." His words captured the tragedy of the Republic, valor unmatched by strategy. By year's end, the balance of the war had tilted further toward the nationalists. They had seized Malaga, crushed the Zaragoza offensive, and gained critical territory in the north. The Republic still fought, but its resources were dwindling, its unity fragile. 1937 proved that this was no short war of quick victories. It was a war of exhaustion, where each campaign drained the Republic further and strengthened Franco's grip. Spain was bleeding, and the world was beginning to see the outlines of its fate. Wars are not fought only by generals and statesmen. They are lived day by ordinary men and women, each with their own hopes, fears, and fragile moments of courage. The Spanish Civil War, perhaps more than most, left behind a chorus of voices that speak to us still. Letters from soldiers on both sides reveal the raw humanity behind the front lines. A young Republican wrote to his family, "We fight with no boots, no coats, but with the conviction that justice is on our side. Do not worry for me, mother. I am happier here than in hunger at home." Another, serving in Franco's army, confessed, "The officers say we fight for God and Spain, but I fight so that I might return to our village alive. Pray for me." Foreign volunteers, too, left their testimonies. The international brigades were a strange and stirring mixture. Students, workers, poets, exiles, all converging on Spain to battle fascism. Americans from the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, French workers from Paris, Polish miners, British idealists. They marched under red flags, chanting songs of solidarity. Many had never fired a rifle before, yet they stood in trenches beside Spaniards, believing they fought not for Spain alone, but for the future of the world. George Orwell, who served in Catalonia with a militia, later recalled, "The thing that I saw in Spain, and that I have seen nowhere else, was the working class in the saddle. It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class was in command of everything." His words captured the revolutionary spirit that burned in Republican zones, even amid chaos and scarcity. Yet for every voice of idealism, there was one of despair. A nurse in Madrid described nights spent in overcrowded hospitals. The wounded never stop coming. Boys of 16, men of 50. Some cry for their mothers. Others whisper for morphine. We cannot save them all. Journalists carried Spain's story abroad, shaping how the world perceived the conflict. Ernest Hemingway, writing from Madrid, spoke of courage and ruin in equal measure. His dispatches painted the city as both heroic and doomed, a stage where human endurance was tested to its limits. And through it all, songs and poems filled the air. The Republic sang I Carmela in trenches and taverns. Nationalists prayed and shouted Arriba España before battle. Words and music became weapons of morale, binding fighters to causes greater than themselves. These voices remind us that the war was not abstract ideas or merely lines on a map. It was hunger, cold, and the sound of boots in mud. It was comradeship and betrayal, laughter in trenches, silence after bombardments. In the end, it is not only strategy and battles that define the Spanish Civil War. It is the memory of those who lived it and those who never returned home. Their letters, their songs, their words ensure that we do not see Spain's tragedy only through generals' eyes, but through the hearts of those who bled for it. By 1938, the war had entered its most decisive and exhausting stage. 2 years of conflict had drained Spain of men, weapons, and food. The front lines stretched across the nation like open wounds, and both sides knew the end would be determined not by a single bold stroke, but by endurance. For Franco, the strategy was clear: cut the Republic in two. His forces launched the Aragon offensive in the spring, striking eastward with speed and precision. The nationalists captured town after town, sweeping aside Republican defenses and driving a wedge through Catalonia. By April, they had reached the Mediterranean, splitting Republican territory into two isolated halves. It was a crippling blow. The Republic, desperate to reunite its forces and prove it still had strength, gambled everything on a massive counteroffensive along the Ebro River. What followed was the largest and bloodiest battle of the war. At dawn on July 25, 1938, Republican troops crossed the river under cover of darkness, their pontoon bridges sliding silently through the current. For a moment, surprise was complete. Franco's lines buckled, and villages along the banks fell to the Republic. Spirits soared. Perhaps this was the chance to turn the tide. But the nationalists recovered swiftly. German aircraft of the Condor Legion dominated the skies, strafing bridges and columns. Italian artillery pounded Republican positions with relentless fire. Day after day, the Republicans clung to their ground, but supply lines faltered and exhaustion set in. The Ebro became a graveyard, trenches filled with mud and blood. Soldiers endured weeks of artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and aerial bombardment. Heat scorched the parched hills by day. Cold seeped into bones by night. A British volunteer later recalled, "We lived like rats, hiding by day, moving by night. The sky belonged to them, and each sunrise brought more death." Despite extraordinary courage, the Republic could not match the nationalist superiority in planes, artillery, and logistics. By November, the offensive collapsed. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, and the Republic's last reserves of strength were spent. The Battle of the Ebro was more than a military defeat. It was a breaking point, For Republican soldiers, the realization dawned that bravery alone could not win the war. For Franco, the victory confirmed what he had long believed, that discipline, order, and external support would always overcome chaos and idealism. 1938 ended with the Republic shattered, its armies in retreat, its people weary beyond words. The war was not yet over, but its outcome was now all but certain. Franco's path to victory lay open. Spain had reached the year of decision, and the decision had been made, not by politics or speeches, but by rivers running red with sacrifice. The Republic's defeat at the Ebro left it broken. Its armies were exhausted, its reserves of weapons and food depleted, and its morale on the brink of collapse. Yet it still held one last bastion of strength, Catalonia. With Barcelona as its beating heart, Catalonia had long been a center of industry, culture, and Republican resolve. If it fell, the Republic would have no shield left. In January 1939, Franco struck. His armies, bolstered by German and Italian divisions, surged into Catalonia with overwhelming force. The offensive was methodical, relentless. Villages fell one by one. Factories that had once churned out weapons for the Republic stood silent, either destroyed or abandoned. Resistance was fierce in places but scattered and desperate. Barcelona itself, a city once alive with revolutionary fervor, now faced encirclement. In its early days, workers had seized factories, anarchists had declared a new world, and foreign volunteers had marched through its streets. By 1939, those days were gone. Hunger stalked every household. Disease spread through neighborhoods, and the people were too weary to resist. On January 26th, Franco's troops entered Barcelona. There was no last stand, no heroic street battle like Madrid. Instead, the city seemed to sigh in exhaustion. Republican officials fled toward the French border, carrying what remained of the government's records and treasury. Tens of thousands of civilians joined them, forming a river of refugees trudging north through snow and mud. Old men, women, and children carried bundles on their backs, pushing carts with whatever possessions they could salvage. This exodus became known as La Retirada, the retreat. It was not just an evacuation, it was a national tragedy. Over 400,000 people fled into France, where they were met not with open arms but with barbed wire and internment camps. Families were torn apart, children lost in the chaos. And for many, exile became permanent. Spain's tragedy spilled across borders, its wounds carried into the wider world. Franco's triumph in Catalonia was more than a military victory. It was a symbolic one. With Barcelona subdued, the Republic's dream lay in ruins. The great experiment in democracy, reform, and revolution had collapsed under the weight of war, betrayal, and fatigue. All that remained was Madrid, isolated and starving, waiting for the inevitable. For Franco, Catalonia's fall marked the moment he could finally claim to have conquered not just territory but the spirit of the Republic. Spain was his. The war was not officially over, but its outcome was sealed. The streets of Barcelona fell silent, save for the sound of nationalist boots. The red flags were torn down, replaced with banners of the new Spain. And in that silence, one era ended and another began, an era of dictatorship that would last for nearly 4 decades. War is not only fought with guns and bullets. It is fought with bread, water, and salt. Franco understood this better than most. As his armies advanced, they did not just conquer cities. They seized farms, factories, and granaries. Food became a weapon wielded with precision to crush resistance and bend civilians to his will. Catalonia, with its rich agricultural plains and industrious towns, had been a lifeline for the Republic. Its orchards, vineyards, and fields fed cities like Barcelona and Madrid. Factories processed grain, canned fruit, and preserved fish, every item a small victory for survival. But as Franco's troops moved in, they confiscated crops, burned warehouses, and redirected supplies to the nationalist lines. Starvation was now a strategic tool. By the winter of 1938 to 1939, hunger had become epidemic. Children's limbs grew thin, faces hollowed, eyes dimmed. Mothers scavenged for roots, weeds, and scraps. Families boiled acorns and bark into soups. Hunger was not just a hardship. It was psychological warfare. It sapped morale, broke communities, and forced people to flee. Every famine-stricken village was a victory for Franco, even without firing a shot. Propaganda amplified the effect. Nationalist posters depicted Republican areas as lawless, chaotic, and unworthy of sympathy. Newspapers claimed that only under Franco would order, bread, and justice return. Starving citizens, seeing their neighbors flee toward France, began to doubt the Republic's promises. If the government could not feed them, why should they fight for it? Meanwhile, in Madrid, the blockade tightened. Roads were cut, railways destroyed, and the city's last reserves dwindled. Republican officials attempted rationing, but corruption, mismanagement, and sheer scarcity undermined every effort. The population faced a grim calculation: endure hunger and hope for relief, or abandon the city for an uncertain exile. Food, more than guns, dictated the final movements of the war. Franco's secret weapon, the control of sustenance, enabled him to conquer hearts and lands alike. By the time nationalist forces reached the outskirts of Madrid, the city was not only militarily vulnerable, it was spiritually exhausted. Starvation had done what years of battle could not. It had weakened the Republic from within. This strategic mastery of scarcity underscored a chilling lesson. Victory in war is as much about managing civilians as defeating armies. Franco had learned it well, and as Spain's people suffered, the nationalist path to total control grew ever clearer. March 1939. The city that had resisted for nearly 3 years, the heartbeat of Republican Spain, now trembled under the weight of inevitability. Madrid, once a symbol of defiance, was a city exhausted, broken, and starving. Its streets whispered stories of courage, sacrifice, and despair. Franco's forces approached not merely with artillery and infantry but with the quiet efficiency of inevitability. Encirclement had done its work. The Republic was starved, its morale shattered, its leadership paralyzed. Food shortages combined with relentless nationalist pressure had hollowed out both civilian and military resistance. What remained was a city on the edge of surrender. Inside Madrid, the Republican leadership clung to hope. But it was a fragile thing. Ministers argued over evacuation, over negotiation, over whether to continue the fight. Soldiers were malnourished, their uniforms tattered, their guns low on ammunition. Bomb shelters and barricades that once teemed with determined fighters were now silent or abandoned. Fear and hunger had replaced resolve. The nationalist entry into Madrid was almost anticlimactic. Citizens, aware of the futility of resistance, lined the streets, not with banners, but with watchful eyes and anxious hearts. Franco's troops moved in, disciplined and methodical, facing little opposition. Unlike the chaos that had marked other cities' falls, Madrid's surrender was orderly, almost ceremonial. Franco himself toured the streets, a figure of control and poise. For him, Madrid's capture was more than military victory. It was psychological dominance. The capital's fall signaled to the world and to Spain that the Republic was finished. Newspapers controlled by nationalists would soon declare it a triumph of order over chaos, of unity over division. Yet for the citizens, victory and defeat were not so easily separated. Families emerged from basements to confront empty markets and destroyed neighborhoods. Children who had known nothing but conflict for their entire lives stared at the foreign banners now raised over their schools and plazas. The city mourned its losses quietly, privately, while the new regime prepared to imprint its authority on every corner of Madrid. The fall of Madrid was the final act of the Spanish Civil War. Militarily, politically, and morally, the Republic had been undone. Franco's vision of a unified Spain, dictated from the center, controlled by force, and sustained by fear, was now realized. Yet the victory was neither simple nor absolute. The scars of civil war ran deep, and the nation would remember them for generations to come. With Madrid firmly under nationalist control, Franco moved swiftly to consolidate power across Spain. The war was over, but the struggle for dominance and memory had only just begun. The mechanisms of repression, long prepared and honed during the conflict, were unleashed with chilling efficiency. Nationalist tribunals, often little more than instruments of terror, began their work immediately. Republican officials, intellectuals, union leaders, and even teachers, anyone suspected of loyalty to the fallen republic, were arrested. Some were executed summarily, others sent to prison camps, their fates sealed by suspicion rather than proof. Families of the accused were stigmatized, property confiscated, and communities fractured. Fear became the currency of daily life. Franco's regime sought not just to eliminate opposition but to erase its memory. Republican symbols, flags, monuments, and literature were destroyed or hidden. Schools were purged of educators with Republican sympathies, replaced by instructors who glorified the nationalist cause. History itself was rewritten. The narrative of the Civil War became a story of rebellion crushed, disorder ended, and Spain restored. In parallel, the new government implemented strict social control. Political organizations were banned, regional languages suppressed, and censorship enforced across newspapers, radio, and the arts. The Falange, Franco's ideological vanguard, became the engine of propaganda, embedding the image of a unified, obedient Spain into every facet of public life. Economically, the country faced devastation. The war had destroyed infrastructure, industry, and farmland. Franco's policies initially prioritized the military and loyal elites, leaving ordinary citizens to endure scarcity and rationing. Starvation, disease, and poverty stalked the population, particularly in regions that had resisted nationalist rule. Yet in Franco's controlled narrative, these hardships were framed as temporary sacrifices on the road to national regeneration. The psychological impact of repression was profound. Generations grew up in silence, afraid to speak their minds, fearful of association, and wary of history itself. Memories of Republican Spain survived mainly in whispers, hidden diaries, and private photographs. Families mourned quietly, commemorating fallen relatives in secret, while public spaces bore only the sanitized face of Franco's Spain. Internationally, Franco's Spain remained diplomatically isolated for a time, particularly during and immediately after World War II. Yet the regime skillfully navigated shifting global alliances, eventually gaining acceptance from Western powers during the Cold War for its anti-communist stance. Inside Spain, however, the shadow of the Civil War lingered, shaping politics, culture, and society for decades. The aftermath of the Spanish Civil War was thus a dual reality. Victory for Franco and the nationalists, cemented by fear, repression, and control, and a collective trauma for the defeated Republicans and ordinary citizens whose lives had been irrevocably scarred by violence, deprivation, and loss. The war's end marked not a return to peace but the beginning of a long, controlled silence that would endure until Spain's eventual transition to democracy many decades later. Spain, in the years following the Civil War, was a nation cloaked in silence and uniformity. Franco's authoritarian grip extended into every corner of life, ensuring that the lessons of rebellion or resistance were carefully erased from public memory. Streets, schools, workplaces, and churches all bore the imprint of a meticulously crafted ideology. Loyalty to the Caudillo, devotion to the Catholic Church, and the myth of a harmonious, united Spain. Education became one of the most effective tools of control. Textbooks recast history to glorify nationalist victories, vilify Republicans, and suppress regional identities. Children learned about traitors and rebels in sanitized, heroic terms, while regional languages such as Catalan, Basque, and Galician were forbidden in schools and official communications. These measures ensured that entire generations grew up knowing only one sanctioned narrative. Franco's Spain was orderly, moral, and destined to endure. Cultural expression, too, was carefully monitored. Literature, theater, and film were censored to eliminate dissenting voices, while the arts that conformed to Francoist ideology were lavishly promoted. Music, painting, and cinema celebrated the virtues of obedience, Catholic morality, and national unity. Meanwhile, private lives were scrutinized. Neighborhoods and villages relied on networks of informants, where a single remark against the regime could lead to arrest or social ostracism. Economically, Spain faced hardship, particularly during the 1940s. The war had left the country impoverished, its infrastructure devastated, and its people hungry. Initially, Franco's autarkic policies sought self-sufficiency, but they only deepened poverty and isolation. International aid was limited, and the Spanish economy stagnated under heavy state control and rationing. By the 1950s, modest industrial growth began, but inequality remained stark, and rural regions suffered chronic neglect. Politically, opposition was effectively neutralized. Republican parties were banned, leftist unions crushed, and any attempt at political dissent met with imprisonment or exile. Many intellectuals fled abroad, forming diasporic communities that preserved Republican ideals far from the reach of Franco's security apparatus. Inside Spain, fear maintained the appearance of unity as citizens adapted to survive under surveillance and repression. Yet beneath the surface, resistance never entirely disappeared. Secret gatherings, clandestine publications, and whispered stories kept memory alive. Families preserved hidden photographs, letters, and mementos of those lost to the war. Regional traditions were quietly maintained in private homes, even as public expression was forbidden. Franco's Spain may have been uniform on the surface, but beneath that imposed calm, a mosaic of cultural and political defiance persisted. Internationally, the Franco regime gradually gained recognition. After initial post-war isolation, the onset of the Cold War transformed Spain into a strategic ally for the West. Anti-communism became the key that unlocked diplomatic doors, allowing Franco to negotiate military and economic support from the United States. Despite the regime's brutality and authoritarianism, geopolitical pragmatism provided it with survival and a degree of legitimacy on the world stage. By the 1960s, Spain had entered a period of cautious modernization. Cities expanded, tourism increased, and consumer goods slowly improved living standards. Yet the legacy of war, repression, and fear remained embedded in society. The silence imposed by Franco's regime had not just shaped politics. It had seeped into culture, family structures, and personal identity. A nation's memory had been reshaped, and the echoes of the Civil War continued to inform Spanish life decades after the last shots were fired. Even decades after Franco's death in 1975, the Spanish Civil War remained an invisible yet omnipresent shadow over the nation. The war's wounds had never fully healed. Families were divided, communities bore unspoken grudges, and public memory was fragmented between the silence imposed by dictatorship and the stories preserved in private. The transition to democracy, known as the transition, was politically peaceful but socially delicate. Avoiding retribution became a conscious choice as Spain sought to stabilize itself while carrying the burden of unspoken history. The Pact of Forgetting, or Pacto de Olvido, defined this era. Lawmakers, politicians, and ordinary citizens tacitly agreed not to dredge up the horrors of the past. Trials were avoided, and many of the perpetrators of repression retained positions of power. The wounds were left unexamined in public forums, leaving victims' families with unacknowledged grief. Monuments to Franco and nationalist victories remained in some areas, while memorials to Republican fighters were suppressed or forgotten. This uneasy silence created a latent tension as personal and collective memories clashed with the state's official narrative. Historians and journalists began to probe the silence cautiously. In the 1980s and 1990s, scholarly work and investigative reporting started uncovering hidden atrocities, mass graves, executions, and disappearances that had been systematically erased from public consciousness. These revelations ignited debates across Spain. Some demanded recognition and justice. Others feared that reopening old wounds would destabilize the fragile democracy. The struggle over memory, what to remember and how, became a defining feature of post-Franco Spain. Cultural production also reflected this tension. Literature, film, and theater began confronting the legacy of the war, often through allegory and symbolism to navigate lingering political sensitivities. Works like The Spirit of the Beehive, El Espíritu de la Colmena, and later films such as Pan's Labyrinth, El Laberinto del Fauno, explored the personal and societal scars left by authoritarianism and civil strife. These creative expressions allowed a generation to grapple with history indirectly, using art as a bridge between memory and understanding. The regional dimension of the conflict continued to shape politics. Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia maintained strong regional identities and movements for autonomy, partially rooted in the repression they suffered under Franco. The war and dictatorship had deepened divisions between centralized authority and regional self-determination, a tension that remains central in Spanish politics today. Education gradually began to reflect the complexity of Spain's past. Republican histories, personal testimonies, and critical analyses entered school curricula, challenging decades of censorship. Museums and memorials were established, including the Valley of the Fallen, Valle de los Caídos, and the Archive of the Spanish Civil War. Yet the process of reconciliation was slow and uneven. Some families embraced public remembrance. Others remained wary, preferring private memory over state-sanctioned narratives. Generational differences shaped the collective understanding of the war. Those who lived through it retained vivid, often painful memories. Younger generations approached the past with curiosity, empathy, and sometimes frustration at the silence that had shaped their upbringing. The tension between remembrance and forgetting, between justice and pragmatism, continues to define Spanish society, reflecting the deep imprint of a war that destroyed not just buildings but trust, culture, and identity. Ultimately, the legacy of the Spanish Civil War is a testament to the resilience and fragility of memory. The nation's journey toward reconciliation, recognition, and historical truth is ongoing. Spain's past cannot be erased, and the war's echoes continue to resonate in politics, culture, and social life, a reminder that the human cost of conflict often persists long after the last shots have been fired. The Spanish Civil War, a maelstrom of ideology, ambition, and human suffering, left an indelible mark on the nation. Its legacy is not confined to textbooks or archives. It lives in the streets, in families, and in the collective consciousness of a people who experienced both terror and resilience. Spain's struggle illustrates the complex interplay between memory and identity, justice and pragmatism, silence and expression. Wars are not merely fought on battlefields. They are fought in homes, in schools, in the very stories that generations tell one another. For Spain, the Civil War became both a rupture and a mirror, revealing the deepest divisions of society and the extraordinary capacity of its people to endure. The trauma persisted not just in political structures or monuments, but in the psychological and cultural fabric of the nation. The pact of forgetting may have delayed reckoning, but it could not erase memory entirely. History, in its impartiality, offers lessons beyond blame. It underscores the fragility of democracy, the dangers of polarization, and the ethical imperative to remember. As Spain rebuilt itself from dictatorship toward a modern democratic state, it faced the challenge of reconciling with a past that was both personal and national. Memory became a battlefield in its own right, between those who sought to preserve silence and those who demanded acknowledgement. The war's influence extends far beyond Spain's borders. It serves as a cautionary tale for nations confronting internal division, ideological extremism, or authoritarian ambition. The images of children fleeing bombardments, of families torn apart, and of civilians struggling under totalitarian control resonate universally. These stories remind us that human cost cannot be measured solely in statistics or dates. It is etched into lives, memories, and culture. Yet amid the tragedy, there is resilience. Spain's eventual democratic transition, its literary and cinematic explorations of the war, and the gradual acknowledgement of victims' experiences demonstrate the power of reflection, dialogue, and art. Memory, though painful, becomes a foundation for understanding, empathy, and reconciliation. It transforms collective suffering into lessons for future generations. As historians, educators, and storytellers continue to explore the Spanish Civil War, they do more than recount events. They illuminate the enduring questions of morality, governance, and human dignity. The war, once a story of division and destruction, now also serves as a lens through which contemporary society can examine its values, confront its prejudices, and honor its losses. In the end, the Spanish Civil War teaches that the echoes of conflict persist far longer than the conflict itself. The scars, both visible and invisible, guide a nation toward vigilance, compassion, and a deeper understanding of what it means to endure and remember. Through this reflection, Spain and the world learns that history is never simply behind us. It is a living conversation between past and present, warning and wisdom, sorrow and hope. The stories of those who lived, fought, and suffered remind us that remembrance is an act of courage, that memory is a moral responsibility, and that reconciliation, though imperfect, is always worth pursuing.